This video is sponsored by Raycon, my go-to pair of earbuds for the past 3 years now. With 8 hours of playtime and 32 hours of battery life, Raycon earbuds are extremely reliable and convenient. They're super comfortable, with optimized gel tips for the perfect in-ear fit, making them the perfect choice for long commutes or lazy weekends on the sofa. For more physically demanding activities, you don't need to worry about them falling out. Raycon earbuds stay in place, no matter what. What makes them so indispensable for me though, is that they come jam-packed with features. With Raycon earbuds, you can seamlessly switch between 3 customizable sound profiles. Pure Sound, which I use whenever I'm losing myself in spooky podcasts. Balance Sound, for warmth and depth whenever I'm vibing to some John Coltrane. And Bass Sound, which really brings my old school hip-hop playlist to life. With the press of a button, you can alternate between noise isolation mode and awareness mode. The former for when you want to block out the world, and the latter for when you want to hear what's going on around you. Right now you can help support the channel while also getting a huge discount on Raycon products. Click the link in my description box or go to buyraycon.com/masquerade and you'll get a massive 15% off your Raycon purchase. Actress Ada Constance Kent was born in England around the year of 1880 and spent most of her working life in and around the theatres of London's West End. She made a brief transition to motion pictures in the late 1930s, with uncredited roles in Princess O'Hara and Tomorrow's Children. But, unfortunately for Ada, her career accomplishments aren't the reason that she's still remembered today. After failing to score any leading roles, Ada announced that she was retiring from acting and promptly moved to the small village of Fingringhoe, Essex. No snickering now. Ada was a reclusive soul who never socialised with the other locals and who was rarely seen around the village. Her elusive nature and past fame made her all the more mysterious to the other villagers, who often gossiped about the wealthy actress turned hermit who lived amongst them. But their interest in Ada only truly peaked when she suddenly and inexplicably disappeared from the face of the earth. In late March of 1939, a tradesman knocked on Ada's front door, but she didn't answer. A gardener named Reuben G. Winkle claimed to have spotted her bedroom light on the previous night, so initially nobody was too concerned. The eccentric woman had a habit of wandering off for long periods of time. But 3 months later, when a friend came to visit Ada at her cottage and found that it was still empty, she was officially declared a missing person. 2 local constables visited the cottage to investigate the matter. Curiously, they found that the front door had been left unlocked. A dinner tray with a fully prepared meal on it sat on the kitchen table. An open copy of Romeo and Juliet was resting on an armchair, and Ada's coat was still hanging on the rack. It seemed that wherever she had gone, she had left in a hurry. Otherwise, everything else was as it should have been. There were no signs of foul play, and nothing to suggest that Ada hadn't left of her own free will. 3 years passed without anyone seeing or hearing from Ada. One of her concerned friends, a man named George Wicknell, travelled to her cottage in hopes of finding some trace of the missing spinster. George thoroughly searched each of the cottage's rooms, but found no useful clues that would indicate what happened to his wayward friend. All was quiet for 9 long years, until, finally, Ada's bank manager noticed something unusual. Since she was considered missing and not dead, Ada's accounts had remained open, though for almost a decade, not a single transaction had taken place. Then, suddenly, in September 1948, someone had made several large deposits into her account. The bank manager quickly contacted the local police, and for a brief period, the investigation into Ada's disappearance was reopened. On a hunch, detectives decided to once again search her cottage. But unlike before, the house wasn't empty. Sitting in a wooden chair in one of the cottage's front rooms was a fully dressed skeleton, and lying next to it, an empty bottle simply labelled poison. Naturally, the discovery horrified local law enforcement, who had already conducted several fruitless searches of the cottage. Coroners from Scotland Yard conducted a thorough examination of the remains, and in a bizarre twist, they noted that the skeleton was larger than one befitting Ada's small stature, and more closely resembled a male's frame. As such, they couldn't conclusively state whether it belonged to Ada or not. Small tufts of hair still attached to the skull matched with hairs found on a brush in the bedroom, prompting a coroner's jury to conclude that the bones were Ada's, though many people aren't so sure. A number of independent homicide investigators have since come forward with the same horrifying theory: that the skeleton wasn't Ada. If true, that raises a huge number of other questions. Most obviously, who did it belong to? Had a homeless person snuck into Ada's abandoned cottage for the night and ended their own existence? If it was a male, why were they wearing women's clothing? Did somebody in the nearby area have a body that they needed to dispose of and thought they could pass it off as Ada? Did a sinister individual want to exhibit their handiwork? All investigators knew was that there hadn't been a skeleton in the cottage during their past searches, and now there was. Frustratingly, a cause of death couldn't be determined. While the bottle clearly suggested that the victim had been poisoned, there was no way of proving that by skeletal analysis alone. Nor were experts able to determine if the person had perished inside the cottage or elsewhere. After yet another round of police questioning, a villager claimed to have spotted Ada during her final days, and said that when Ada had entered the Whalebone pub on the 6th of March, just a couple of weeks before she vanished, she had looked extremely poorly. Reportedly, she was very pale and was almost continuously coughing during a brief exchange with the owner. This has led some to suggest that Ada was very ill. They theorize that she had simply taken a long trip away from the village, returned at some point thereafter, and passed away of natural causes inside her cottage. Yet there are others who suggest that her symptoms and the bottle were evidence of murder by poisoning. As it stands, this case remains shrouded in mystery, and given how old it is, that's not likely to change. Honestly, there's very little information about this case online, and of the reports that do exist, many seem to conflict with one another. As such, we can't say for certain what exactly happened to Ada, whether she upped and left to spend her final years elsewhere, or whether she was butchered, whether the remains were hers or not. We also can't say who paid the money into her account 9 years after she vanished, or why. All we can say with certainty is that Ada's end was even more dramatic than her career. A body appearing out of thin air, a bottle labelled poison, mysterious bank deposits appearing as if meant to reignite the case. It all seems so fittingly theatrical. Those involved in this next mystery haven't officially been named by the authorities yet, so to avoid saying the man and the woman ad nauseum, I'll instead be using pseudonyms. On the evening of March 9th, 2022, a man in the northern French region of Eure named Luc telephoned his former partner, Marie, and told her a horrifying story. The 46-year-old carpenter sounded drunk as he explained how he had gotten into a traffic accident, one in which he had slammed his car into a female cyclist. Marie was of course troubled to hear that, and asked if everything was alright. Luc babbled on about how he had reported the incident to the cops, and how it had been the biker's fault and not his own. He insisted that the cyclist was in good health, but the damage to the windscreen of his Audi suggested otherwise. A friend of Marie's must have suspected that something was up, since he drove past Luc's home that very same evening and stopped to take photographs of his car. There was a large, circular impact dent on the windscreen, which had a, quote, red mark in the centre. After being forwarded the photos, Marie contacted the local police. Contrary to her ex-husband's claims, no such accident report had been filed. Furious about the deception, Marie attempted to contact Luke by telephone, and after 3 days of radio silence, she drove over to his home to demand answers. When she arrived on the morning of March 12th, Marie spotted Luke's Audi, along with the damage it sustained in the collision, but she also noticed traces of what appeared to be blood on the right side of the vehicle. After knocking on the front door of his home for a sustained period, she concluded that no one was home. 24 hours later, Luke called her up, and it was during this call that he made a stunning confession. He admitted that he may have downplayed what actually happened after the crash on March 9th. The truth was that he had struck a cyclist at high speed whilst under the influence of alcohol, and said that her wounds had actually been fatal. Then, instead of calling the police, he put the bike and her body in the trunk of his car and went looking for a shovel with which to dig her grave. After a brief trip back home, Luke then drove to a secluded area, dug a deep pit, and prepared to drag the cyclist to her final resting place. Yet, upon opening up the trunk, he discovered that the woman was still alive and was weakly begging for help. In a decision so callous that it defies comprehension, Luke didn't help her, but instead bludgeoned her to death with the shovel. To him, slaying her was preferable to facing the consequences of a DUI. The man wept down the line and begged his ex-wife not to reveal his dark secret. Overcome with the burden of a guilty conscience, Marie went to her local police station 2 months later and accused her ex-partner of murder, telling them everything that he had confessed to her. An investigation was opened into the cyclist's disappearance, but no corresponding missing persons report had been filed, so it was impossible to know who exactly had been killed. However, police did manage to talk to the former girlfriend of the accused, who claimed that she had spoken with him around the time of the alleged murder. The girl claimed Luke had called her and said that he wasn't well in the head. When she asked why, he seemed unwilling to talk about it, but eventually confessed to, quote, knocking down an old lady when at the wheel of his car and having killed her before burying her. Once the police were given the photographs of the damaged Audi, they knew that securing the vehicle would be the key to conviction. Yet, when dozens of police officers descended on Luke's property, his car was nowhere to be found. Unbelievably, Luke claimed that his car had been stolen the night before. The vehicle was later found abandoned and burned in a secluded, wooded area. Luke feigned ignorance, claiming that he wasn't responsible for destroying the vehicle, yet the scorching of such a crucial piece of evidence was too suspicious for the French authorities to overlook, and even without a body, they promptly took Luke in on suspicion of murder. During his initial round of questioning, Luke claimed that he had made up the entire story about the cyclist in hopes of it bringing him closer to his ex, Marie. He claimed that it was nothing but a kind of prank, and that he had damaged his own car before spreading chicken blood on it. At that point, investigators showed him the photos of his damaged vehicle. After being confronted by those images, Luke admitted that he had hit a cyclist after all, but once again insisted that they had ridden away unharmed. Luke also admitted to setting fire to his own car, but after that, he stopped talking entirely. He never indicated where he may have hidden his victim. Luke has since been the subject to additional rounds of questioning and has even made an appearance in court. Yet, until the cyclist's remains are uncovered, a conviction is highly unlikely. The authorities are convinced that Luke is guilty of taking a cyclist's life, and that they're only a hair's breadth away from putting him behind bars. But as it stands, time is ticking away. The investigation is unlikely to progress until a missing persons report can be linked to the case, as with no clue to the identity of the victim, punishing the killer is almost impossible. French police have since stated that they believe the victim may not have been reported missing and may have been living alone and isolated at the time of the incident. It's possible that in contrast to Luke's initial reports that she looked like a tramp, the victim was actually very wealthy. A person with 2 homes, say, wouldn't be noticed as a missing person in the same way someone with 1 home would be. But then again, such a person is much more likely to be reported missing in a timely manner. It's entirely possible that the driver killed a lonely and solitary old woman, someone with so few connections to the world around her that she may as well have been a ghost. As a result of such a lifestyle, it stands to reason that her killer may never face justice. Until detectives find her remains, she's doomed to remain in a Schrödinger-like state. A victim who both does and doesn't exist. And until it's proven that she does, her killer will continue to walk free. Brandon Swanson was born on the 30th of January, 1989, and spent his formative years in the city of Marshall, Minnesota. Following his graduation from high school in 2007, Brandon enrolled at the Minnesota West Community and Technical College and studied wind turbines. He proved himself to be a dedicated student who wished only to contribute to a brighter, greener future. When the academic year came to an end on May 13th, 2008, Brandon and his friends celebrated by attending two separate parties, both held in the college students' dormitories. Friends of Brandon's later said that he drank at both parties, but knowing that he had to drive home later that night, did so conservatively to ensure that he was under the legal limit. He was, by all accounts, of clear and sober mind when he left. Shortly after midnight, Brandon said his goodbyes and got into the driver's side seat of his Chevrolet Lumina. He then began the 30-mile drive back to his hometown of Marshall. It was a simple, southeasterly drive, one that should have taken no longer than 30 to 40 minutes. But for some reason, Brandon was still on the road at around 1:45 a.m. It was at that time that his journey was brought to a screeching halt. Brandon telephoned his parents, Brian and Annette, and told them that he had crashed his car into a roadside ditch. A childhood injury had left him near blind in one eye, which affected both his night vision and depth perception, so although alarming, the accident wasn't altogether surprising. Brandon was shaken, but assured both his parents that he was unharmed, and asked if they could drive out and give him a ride back home. Brian and Annette got into their pickup truck and drove along Highway 68 in the direction they believed their son was stranded. There was just one problem. Brandon didn't know exactly where he was, as he had almost certainly taken a wrong turn at some point in his journey. Given the layout of the area, he may well have been suffering from familiarity displacement and wound up somewhere he had never been before. As such, his parents kept him on the phone, telling him to use his flashlight to signal passing cars so that they'd be able to find him. Brian and Annette continued along Highway 68, but after driving for around half an hour, they failed to spot any flashlights at the roadside. Brandon's father realized that his son must not be on Highway 68 after all, and so asked him if he could spot the lights of any towns around him. When Brandon replied that he could, his father suspected that the lights were coming from the small town of Lind, roughly 7 miles southwest of Marshall. Brian told his son to walk towards that town so that they could meet somewhere they were both familiar with, the parking lot of a popular bar and grill. Brandon stayed on the line as he cut through some fields. He and his father had been on the phone for exactly 47 minutes by that point, and it seemed just a matter of time before they were reunited. And yet, just after 2:30 a.m., Annette and Brian heard something on the other end of the line that would replay in their minds for the rest of their lives. Without warning, Brandon suddenly screamed, "Oh shit!" as if taken by surprise, before falling completely silent. His father called out his name into the phone, but there was no response. Thinking that they had lost connection, Brian hung up and tried calling Brandon back, but there was no answer. Brian began ceaselessly calling his son's phone, but the longer Brandon failed to answer, the more it became obvious that something was wrong. Unable to find any trace of their son along the roadside, Brandon's parents reported him missing as soon as they were able to, but to their frustration, local law enforcement seemed completely disinterested. One officer told them that it was, quote, hardly unusual for young men that age to stay out all night after the last day of college, while another seemed to imply that the Swansons were being controlling. Brian later said that that same officer had told them that Brandon had a right to go missing, and refused to investigate until there had been no contact for 24 hours. Brandon's parents were forced to take their case to Lynn's chief of police, and after an impassioned plea, a search party was finally formed. A few hours later, police officers located Brandon's abandoned Chevy. It was lying in a ditch, just as he had described, and although there were no signs of foul play, there were also no signs of Brandon anywhere. When his cell phone was traced to nearby Yellow Medicine County, multiple search teams used bloodhounds and helicopters to scour the area. Later that day, one of the dogs picked up a scent. Search and rescue personnel followed the dog along a 3-mile trail which snaked through nearby fields in the direction of an abandoned farm. From that farm, the tracker dog followed Brandon's trail to the Yellow Medicine River, where the scent abruptly disappeared. When Brandon's father confirmed that his son had heard running water as he had walked, detectives began to suspect that he may have fallen into the river and drowned. Specially trained divers combed through the river, but no trace of Brandon was discovered. Sadly, less than 1 week after Brandon went missing, local law enforcement were forced to scale back their search for him. Given how long he had been gone, it stood to reason that there was only a slim chance he was still alive. Some weren't so cynical. Brandon's parents, along with almost every home in his neighborhood, kept their porch lights on as a symbol of their hope that Brandon would eventually return. Sheriff Vizecki also held out hope and continued to walk the 2-mile search area along the Yellow Medicine River on a daily basis for the next month. By autumn of 2008, the sheriff had organized a large, cross-county task force to search the freshly harvested fields surrounding Highway 68. One of the major impediments to the original search had been the ocean of corn and wheat stalks covering the search area, some of which dwarfed even the tallest members of the search crew. With such a huge obstacle now gone, Sheriff Vizecki knew there was no better time to continue the search. Almost immediately, cadaver dogs began to pick up on the scent of human remains in a previously unsearched area. Again, no physical evidence was found, but the scent was found around an area with farming equipment, leading some to theorize that Brandon may have been pulverized by a harvester. By the spring of 2011, more than 122 square miles had been searched. But despite such a mammoth effort, not a single usable lead was recovered. It was like Brandon had simply dropped off the face of the earth. No trace of the young man could be found anywhere. As far as tangible theories are concerned, there's very little evidence to suggest that Brandon drowned that night. He was only within earshot of the Yellow Medicine River, not nearly close enough to fall in, and when a tracker dog did follow Brandon's scent trail to the water, it continued to the other side and down a gravel road. His father, Brian, also insisted that his son didn't seem disoriented or intoxicated during their phone conversation. There's little evidence that Brandon ran away from home either. He and his parents had a close and loving relationship, enough so that his first thought was to call them when he got in trouble. Even if he had run away, surely there would have been sightings of him in the area during the days that followed. The one possibility that can't be ruled out is foul play. That's the explanation that Sheriff Vizecki is most invested in. In his opinion, the fact that Brandon's final word was a single, terrified expletive tells him all he needs to know. Someone could have been lurking in the shadows, he later said. They got him that way. Question is, who are they exactly? Some purport that Brandon fell victim to a mysterious serial slayer. Highway 68 is frequented by hundreds of long-haul truckers every single day. Many of the most prolific slayers in American history have been truckers. It's entirely feasible that Brandon was held up, marched or driven off to a different location somewhere in Yellow Medicine County, and then slaughtered and disposed of in a way that left no trace. But what if he wasn't killed? What if that final expletive was prompted by the sight of someone who wished to keep him a terrified prisoner? One to be tormented daily, long after those that loved him believed he had passed on. One to be trafficked and sold. In the absence of any solid explanation, it's impossible not to examine every possibility, even if some potential theories seem a bit eccentric. But perhaps blaming human traffickers is simply a way to rebrand the hope of Brandon's eventual return. If he is indeed alive and being held somewhere, then there's always that slim chance that he might escape, and that he and his parents will someday be reunited. Frankly, the alternative is too grim to contemplate, because, if true, it means that one night, after making a relatively simple mistake, a promising young man was snatched away from this world, and his loving parents, who will forever grieve his loss, were listening at the exact moment it happened. Well, it is raining quite heavily outside, guys. This is England after all, so hopefully that hasn't ruined the audio for this episode. A huge shout out to Sam Riding for writing the script for this one, and a big thank you to all of my supporters here on YouTube and over on Patreon, especially my biggest supporters. Lydia Cumo, Nephus1988, Itai Alon, Peyton Trolling, Mrs. Yvonne Rankin, Brad Hammer 33, TNS Mum, Zane, The Only Dorita, Taylor and Monica Gruenk, Philip Wester, Peter Logdredge, Monica Mendoza, Lyndon Witebski, Leonardo Martinez, Infamous Sempapi, Ian Billock, Grace Archie, Gina Valera, George Lopez, Dustin and Tiffany Vanderpool, Connor Lotham, Colin Monsma, Chief Kochwake, Cassidy Simpson, Azriel Warakai, Asia Mina, Anya Yekaterina Faustov, Alex Greensall, Clayton Thompson, and Jesse Jug. You will stay spooky. And remember, the best things happen in the dark.